The fields around the Saxon village lay quiet beneath the late autumn sky, the air brittle with the smell of frost. Nothing remarkable separated this village from dozens of others across the countryside. Small timber houses leaned against each other for warmth, their roofs sagging under the weight of years, and the barns stood like mute guardians over the land. But one barn, at the far edge where the road dipped into marshland, was different. People passed it without looking, as though a silent understanding held them back. They called it abandoned, though no one had ever taken it apart for timber and no children dared play inside. It was said to be empty, left for rot, but its door was always latched. Matthias Adler was not the sort of man who let silence pass unrecorded. He was young, hired by the district archive to gather the overlooked details of village life, the forgotten parish records and farm tallies that government men in the city believed were important. He carried notebooks, always filling them with careful script, his curiosity a hunger that seemed to consume the dust of history itself. He came upon the barn in the course of his surveys, expecting another ruin where cattle had once been kept. But something caught his attention immediately. The door was too firm in its frame. Its latch was not rusted but recently oiled, the wood smooth where hands had pushed against it. He placed his fingers against the metal loop and felt the resistance of a bar pressed from the inside. It was a small detail, easily missed, but it told him more than gossip could. Someone, or something, was keeping the barn shut against the world. Matthias stood still, listening. The wind made the timbers creak, but underneath that natural sound was a hush too complete, an absence that pressed into his chest. He looked at the earth around the entrance. No recent boot prints marked the soil, yet the straw beneath the threshold was unnaturally tidy, pushed into clean edges as though swept. The archivist walked the perimeter, noting the boards. They were darkened with age, but none sagged or broke. Where moss usually crept, the planks were bare. He found the windows sealed with nailed shutters, no cracks left to the light. He took down every detail in his book, feeling the strangeness deepen. He could not explain why the sight disturbed him. Perhaps it was the unnatural care given to what villagers dismissed as forgotten. He thought of barns elsewhere, always messy, filled with broken wheels, sagging tools, and birds nesting in rafters. This place allowed no birds. Even the crows circling the fields did not land near it. When he brushed his hand across the outer wall, he found no dust clinging to his fingers. Someone had wiped the surface as if the barn had been polished like furniture in a house. He tried to reason with himself. Perhaps an old farmer used it in secret, perhaps tools were stored inside, perhaps grain. Yet if that were true, why did no villager claim it? Why was it left out of land records? Matthias searched the parish lists later that day, and the barn was mentioned only once, 40 years earlier, as property of a family long dead. After that, no names, no taxes paid, no inheritance filed. As if it had slipped from all ownership, waiting. The following week he returned with iron tools in his bag. He told no one, for the villagers grew uneasy when he asked about the place. They would only shake their heads or change the subject. He sensed fear in their avoidance, the kind passed down silently from one generation to another. They had lived beside the barn so long that its strangeness had become normal. But Matthias was new enough to question. He returned at dusk, the sky gray, the fields empty. The barn stood against the horizon like a black tooth. He tested the latch again. It yielded not at all. He pushed harder, feeling the stubborn resistance of the bar pressed tight on the other side. He tried lifting the hinges, but they were fixed with fresh nails. That was the moment his unease hardened into something colder. If no one admitted to using the barn, who had hammered those nails and when? He set his crowbar beneath the edge of the door. The wood groaned. Dust fluttered down. but not the loose, choking dust of disuse. It came in neat fragments as though swept and arranged. He looked closer at the ground as he worked. The earth bore strange square patterns where straw had been cut and laid in exact grids, each corner sharp. Not the scattering of farm use, but the precise hand of someone obsessed with order. He felt a wave of disgust rise in him, though he did not yet know why. The latch clanged under the crowbar's pressure. Inside, silence pressed against the wood like breath held too long. Matthias's own heart thundered as he leaned his weight. The iron bar slipped once, then caught again. He thought of how often history hid itself in plain sight, how evil rarely announced itself with noise but with patterns, with order, with the illusion of nothing to see. He did not yet imagine what he would find beyond the door, only that whatever it was had been hidden too carefully, too deliberately to be innocent. The lock gave with a snap that echoed unnaturally loud across the empty fields. Matthias staggered back, the door shifting slightly open, enough to spill a draft of air that smelled faintly of wood smoke and something sour beneath it. He steadied himself, pressing his palm to the door frame, his hand trembling without permission. The barn that was supposed to be abandoned had just confessed its first secret. It had never been abandoned at all. With a final push, Matthias pried the door open wider. The air rolled out heavier now, filled with the scent of straw kept too long, of cloth dampened and dried again, of something that carried the memory of bodies though none were present. He raised his lantern, though the flame flickered low. The darkness inside seemed to resist, the light, pulling it inward, swallowing it whole. And in that narrowing glow, Matthias saw the faint outline of rows. Rows that did not belong to grain sacks or barrels. Rows shaped in a way that made the air in his chest stop cold. He stepped across the threshold, unaware that with this act he was placing himself inside the design of another mind, a mind that had been patient enough to wait decades for a curious man to open what no villager dared touch. Behind him, the door creaked on its loosened latch, as though uncertain whether to close again, sealing him in. The lantern flame swayed in Matthias's hand as he moved deeper into the barn, its weak glow licking the air in nervous arcs. At first his eyes told him it was empty, only shadows and rafters stretching above like ribs of some colossal carcass. But as the light steadied, the shapes waiting in the gloom began to take form. Wooden cradles lined in disciplined rows stretched from one end of the loft to the other. He stopped, his breath caught as if he had stumbled into a church of the dead. There were too many to count at once. Dozens upon dozens, each carved by hand, polished smooth as if great care had been taken not only to build them but to arrange them. They faced the same direction, aligned as soldiers might stand, never touching yet never out of place. The precision unnerved him. Farmers did not waste time on symmetry. Here every cradle was measured to the inch, squared to its neighbor, lined in a geometry that felt closer to ritual than to storage. He bent low, running the light across the nearest. The inside was not filled with straw nor soft fabric for infants. Instead, it was lined with blackened cloth, worn thin but neatly folded, as though once washed, once ironed, then deliberately dirtied. It held the smell of smoke, but beneath that lingered a sharper odor, something metallic, the faint taste of iron that sat on the tongue. Matthias pulled his hand away before he touched it. Some instinct told him not to disturb what was inside. Each cradle bore initials carved on its curved headboard. He read them aloud under his breath, a murmur swallowed by the air. HBLKMT. The letters ran on and on. No names, no dates, only initials, as though the maker wanted to remember yet not remember at all. None matched families he had encountered in the village records. These were children without heritage, names erased before they had even been written. Matthias felt his chest tighten as he moved along the rows. the silence between the cradles almost vibrating. It was the kind of silence that had been trained, not given. The loft's floor was swept, but not as a farmer sweeps. The dust was gathered into careful lines along the planks, as if marking out territories. He traced the pattern with his boot, squares again. Each cradle sat inside a square of dust, measured and perfect like graves above the ground. The thought lodged in him heavily. Whoever had done this was not preserving space. They were preserving order. Near the far wall, beneath a beam where the lantern light trembled against cobwebs, Matthias found a desk. Not a farmer's bench, but a clerk's piece of furniture dragged here and set beneath the rafters. On it lay a series of ledgers, their covers plain, their edges worn from years of opening and closing. He reached for the first, his hand trembling, and flipped it open. Inside were columns written in a narrow hand, each page divided by dates. But there were no names. At the top of each entry, a set of initials was written, matching those carved into the cradles. Beyond that, no mention of mothers or fathers, no place of birth, no parish ties. Only measurements, hours and minutes, notations of sound, then silence. He read an early line, cf. 3 hours crying, 1 hour still. Next day, 1 cry, then stillness sustained. Later days, stillness extended, silence perfected. The entries continued with this strange rhythm. A ledger of voices stopped, not lives lived. Matthias's skin crawled as he turned the pages. The script grew tighter, more obsessive. Phrases appeared in the margins. The voice surrenders. Measured peace. Stillness accepted. Some pages bore smudges as if the writer's hand had pressed into soot or ash before resuming. In the back of one ledger he found sketches of cradles, almost identical to those in the loft, each diagram shaded in as though filled, though no figures were drawn inside. He closed the book quickly, his breath uneven. The silence of the barn seemed to press harder against his ears now, as if it wanted him to listen not to what was there but to what had been taken away. He looked again at the rows of cradles. The blackened cloths absorbed the lantern's light, swallowing it into their folds. For the first time, Matthias felt as though he were being watched, though nothing stirred. The cradles seemed to hum without sound, their emptiness loud enough to rattle in his skull. He forced himself to keep steady, to write notes in his own book. He copied down the initials, the strange measurements, the phrases that chilled him. His training as an archivist demanded record even when fear begged him to flee. He knew what he had found was not simple superstition. It was evidence of someone's system, someone's method hidden for years in plain sight. The cold of the loft bit deeper the longer he stayed. He glanced toward the ladder that led down to the barn floor. The door stood ajar below, letting in a faint glow of night, but the loft itself remained a sealed chamber. He felt certain now that the villagers had known, in some unspoken way. Their silence had not been ignorance, it had been avoidance. They had lived with this knowledge without words, leaving it to the dust and the locked door. Matthias's lantern flickered low, the oil nearly spent. Shadows lengthened across the cradles, making their rows blur into one another until they resembled teeth in a great jaw. He closed the ledger, placed it back on the desk, and drew in a long, steadying breath. He told himself he would return in daylight, when the air might feel less oppressive, when his hands would not tremble. But even as he thought it, he knew daylight would not change what he had seen. He gathered his notes, descended the ladder, and stepped out into the chill. Behind him the barn loomed, its loft windows shuttered tight, holding its silence within. He latched the door again, leaving it as he had found it, though the bar inside now hung loose from his intrusion. He turned toward the village road, his boots striking the frozen ground in steady rhythm. But his mind walked elsewhere, circling around the initials carved into wood, the columns of silence recorded like sacred duty. By the time he reached the first houses, Matthias knew the parish archives would hold the next clue. Someone had built that barn for a purpose. Someone had carved those cradles, written those ledgers, measured that silence. He would have to find who and why. Even if the answer meant opening more doors the villagers prayed would remain shut. In the dim archive room of the parish office, Matthias turned brittle pages that smelled of mildew and candle smoke. The village ledger was clear in its brevity. The barn had once been listed under the care of a woman named Elise Baumgartner. No husband was recorded, no children, no siblings who claimed her. A solitary name attached to a property that the community had long avoided, as if by giving it to her they had also passed away responsibility for what lived inside. He traced her name across multiple years. Elise, the seamstress, the one who stitched gowns for baptisms and shrouds for funerals, the one villagers remembered without affection but without scandal. A presence always there, never loud, always willing to sew but never to smile. He found mention of her in baptism records. She had sewn the tiny gowns of lace and linen, recorded as donated by Miss Baumgartner. Her needle was the thread between life's fragile beginnings and its inevitable end. In funeral ledgers, her hand appeared again. Cloths for the dead, altar coverings, veils for grieving mothers. She touched every threshold of life in the village and yet left no threshold of her own. She lived in a narrow timber house, its windows curtained too tightly, its walls unadorned. Children were told not to linger near her doorway, though no one could say why. The warnings were passed like superstition, inherited rather than explained. Among the dusty holdings, Matthias uncovered a slim book bound in cracked leather, her handwriting neat, small, compressed as though she feared wasting paper. At first it seemed like notes on tailoring, patterns, stitch lengths, fabric lists, but as he turned deeper into its pages, the sketches began. Cradles drawn in careful perspective. Infants rendered with surprising accuracy, each marked in places no seamstress would ever need to draw. Tongues sketched with cross-hatched cuts, throats with lines drawn around them as if measured by thread. Beneath some sketches she had written in small, precise words, "The cry stills here. Resistance fades. Perfection is silence." Matthias felt nausea rise as he held the book, but he forced himself to continue. Each page blurred the line between fabric and flesh. She described stitches meant not for cloth but for skin. Fine, piercing motions across soft tissue, the same way one might hem a garment. She wrote of threading linen through wax before pressing it against mouths, to seal them gently, to preserve their purity. Her language was careful, clinical, stripped of emotion. To her it was craft, work like any other. The horror lay in the ordinariness of her tone, as if she were describing a gown rather than a child. The archivist sat back, chilled by the thought that Elise had lived unchallenged in this village for decades. She had touched their children, fitted them for sacred ceremonies, laid garments over the still bodies of the dead. They had trusted her quiet presence, mistaking her lack of warmth for modesty, never suspecting the rituals she performed in shadows. She had hidden cruelty beneath the role of service, weaving herself into the fabric of village life so thoroughly that no one saw where the seam unraveled. Matthias began to search beyond the pages, asking the villagers themselves. Many were reluctant, their voices stiff when her name was mentioned. An older woman remembered that Elise never laughed during the gatherings after baptisms, only sat in a corner smoothing the fabric of her skirt. A farmer recalled how she hummed while sewing, a tune without melody that made the hair on his neck prickle. Children told stories passed down from their parents, that if one cried too loudly at night, Elise might come with her basket of cloth and mend the noise. They said it with nervous smiles, but Matthias could see the residue of fear in their eyes. The journals painted her not as a monster raging in darkness, but as a woman convinced of her purpose. She spoke in her own notes of perfection through silence, of saving mothers from sleeplessness, of offering rest to the village. She believed she was serving them the same way she sewed their gowns. Service was her disguise, but also her conviction. Evil lived in her not as passion, but as patience, in the steady slip of thread through fabric, in the quiet hours when others slept. She stitched children into stillness as calmly as she hemmed a sleeve. Matthias copied her words into his ledger, his handwriting shaking. He could not escape the sense that her journals were not only confession but instruction, as if she had intended someone to follow. The cradles in the loft, the ledgers of silence, and now these sketches. Together they formed a system, a craft passed down like any other trade. What horrified him most was the possibility that no one in the village had ever dared stop her. Perhaps they had sensed her strangeness, but she offered something they needed. The gowns for their baptisms, the cloths for their funerals. She dressed their milestones, and in return they left her alone with her barn and her silence. As he left the archive, the air outside felt thinner, as though the weight of her pages clung to his lungs. He knew he had to return to the barn with this knowledge. The initials carved into the cradles were no longer abstract marks. They were children Elise had touched, perhaps stitched, perhaps stilled. The precision of the loft now looked different in his memory. It was not simply order. It was her craft laid bare. Matthias tightened his coat and walked back toward the village square. He resolved to ask more, to gather the spoken fragments that remained. Somewhere in the fading memories of these people lived the truth of how Elise moved among them, how she balanced her needles of linen and flesh. He feared the answers, but he knew the silence of the barn would not loosen unless the silence of the villagers broke first. The villagers, when pressed, spoke cautiously as though Elise's shadow still lingered over their homes. Their stories came in fragments, hesitant recollections of nights when exhaustion overtook young mothers and Elise appeared at their doors. She carried herself with the calm patience of one who offered help without question. She would take the newborns to her house or to the loft above the barn, promising only a few hours of rest for the parents. To weary women who had not slept in days, it seemed an act of mercy, and so they entrusted her with the most fragile part of their lives. The children returned differently. Some came back quiet, too quiet, eyes wide and unblinking. Others bore faint discolorations around their throats, as if a thin band of pressure had been laid across them. Mothers whispered about it, but never accused her outright. When a baby died in her care, it was explained away as weakness of the lungs, a fever, or God's will. No one wanted to believe otherwise, and Elise never protested or wept. She only sewed the funeral gown herself, hands steady, face composed. Matthias pieced these testimonies together, realizing they described not accidents but patterns. Elise had devised methods, rituals of cruelty masked as caregiving. From her journals, he learned she soaked cloth in vinegar, pressing it against infants' lips until their cries thinned to silence. She wrote of it as if it were a balm, noting how the acid dulled the throat and numbed the will to cry. In her mind, the silence that followed was not harm, but healing, proof that she had tamed the wildness of life. She measured resistance with cords dipped in wax, binding limbs tightly to see how long the children strained before surrendering. The wax stiffened the cords, cutting shallow grooves into tender skin. In her notes, she called these grooves marks of progress, kurz, evidence that the body had acknowledged her control. The cords she believed captured the moment struggle gave way to stillness. The survivors bore these marks for years, scars across wrists and ankles mistaken for birth blemishes by those who chose not to look closer. Elise's most disturbing invention was her linen stitching. With thread prepared in her sewing basket, she pierced the edges of damp cloth and drew it across mouths, knotting it lightly but firmly enough to seal lips. She insisted in her notes that the children did not suffer, that they drifted into a peace unbroken by noise. She wrote of their stillness as a gift to their mothers, a rest they would never outgrow. Some children breathed again after she removed the cloth, their faces pale but eyes fixed in terror. Others never moved once she tied her final knot. The villagers had seen signs, though they dared not name them. A mother recalled how her baby returned with lips red and swollen, refusing to nurse for days. Another remembered lifting her child from Elise's arms and feeling the body stiff, as if it had forgotten how to cling. Rumors spread quietly that Elise had a way of quieting children too completely, that her help carried a price. But these rumors were spoken only in kitchens and behind shutters, never in the square. For every uneasy story, there was another of gratitude. A mother who had slept a full night because Elise had taken the child, a father who praised her for mending clothes while rocking a cradle at the same time. Matthias recognized the danger in this duality. Elise had built her disguise upon service. By giving the villagers what they craved, silence, order, relief, she purchased their blindness. Her cruelty was not reckless but methodical, calculated to fall just short of undeniable until it no longer needed concealment. And when death came, she offered the mourning cloth herself, ensuring her hand was present in both the cause and the cover. From her journals, Matthias read chilling observations, each written as if for a manual. She documented how long it took for vinegar cloth to still a cry, how wax cords left grooves after minutes, how stitched linen silenced even the strongest lungs. She timed the intervals, logged the reactions, and spoke of them not as tragedies but as experiments of stillness. To her, every child was another chance to refine her craft, to reach perfection. The loft full of cradles was her gallery, her workshop, her sanctuary of silence. The archivist felt sick as he copied the lines. Yet he knew this precision made her more dangerous than any wild cruelty. She was not driven by anger or frenzy. She was driven by belief, by the cold patience of one convinced she served a higher order. She thought she was improving life by pruning its noise, offering mothers a vision of children who did not disturb. Her evil lay in her conviction, in her certainty that stillness was better than breath. As Matthias listened to the villagers, he realized some of her victims had survived, carrying scars invisible and visible alike. He heard of a boy who never spoke again after Elise returned him, his throat marked faintly with bruises. Another child grew into a man with hands that trembled when bound even lightly with rope, as though his body remembered what his mind could not. These fragments of living testimony told Matthias that Elise's craft had not ended with death. It had etched itself into the survivors, binding them to her even decades later. Night fell heavy as Matthias closed her journal. The barn seemed to loom larger in his thoughts, the rows of cradles now symbols of her experiments repeated countless times. He imagined her bending over them, hands steady, humming as she worked. She was the seamstress who smiled too little because her satisfaction was not in faces but in silence. He knew now he could not turn away. The parish records, the journals, the testimonies, they painted the portrait of a woman who had transformed care into cruelty, who had hidden her rituals inside the rhythm of service. But to understand the scale of what she had done, Matthias would need to find those who had endured her hands and lived. Survivors were the missing proof, the voices that had been stilled but not extinguished. He resolved to seek them out, to gather what fragments of their truth remained before time buried them as well. Matthias's search led him to the outskirts of the village, to a sagging cottage where an old man named Jonas Keller lived alone. The neighbors described him as peculiar, a man who never joined gatherings, who spoke only in whispers, if at all. Some said he had been marked since childhood, though no one cared to explain why. When Matthias approached, he found Jonas sitting by the hearth. A scarf looped high around his neck despite the warmth of the fire. His eyes were pale and watchful, as though measuring each movement before granting it passage. When Matthias explained his purpose, Jonas studied him in silence for a long moment. Then, with a hand that shook from age more than fear, he loosened the scarf and revealed the skin beneath. Across his throat ran a series of shallow, parallel scars, faded but unmistakable. They looked like channels carved by a knife or a surgeon's scalpel, not deep enough to kill but deliberate enough to mark. Jonas's voice came thin and rough when he spoke. He told Matthias that Elise Baumgartner had done this to him when he was a boy, and that he had carried the wound of her training all his life. He recalled how his mother, worn from weeks of sleeplessness, had entrusted him to Elise for a single night. She had returned him the next morning with words of reassurance. He had been quiet, he had slept soundly. But Jonas remembered otherwise. He remembered being lifted into one of the barn cradles, the smell of soot and vinegar burning in his nostrils, the sound of Elise's humming rising above him like a hymn sung in mockery of church. He remembered her hands pressing against his throat, testing the sound of his cries, then withdrawing to fetch her needles. She had not cut him deeply. Instead, she carved shallow channels across his skin, lines that wept but did not bleed out, tracing them as if sketching a pattern on fabric. Each time he gasped, she paused to mark the rhythm, her humming never faltering. He remembered her words, not soothing but instructive. She whispered that the noise inside him must be guided out, that his throat was too wild, that silence had to be taught. She tied his wrists with cords, dipped in wax as her journals later described, and left him bound until his arms numbed. His tongue burned with vinegar, his lips sealed with cloth pressed against them. Jonas said he survived not because of strength, but because Elise had simply lost interest. She had abandoned him midway, distracted perhaps by another child, or perhaps deciding he was not the subject she wanted. He woke later in the loft, surrounded by rows of cradles, hearing her hum as she walked among them. The air was heavy with the smell of burning fabric, and the silence of other children pressed against his ears more painfully than any wound. He did not remember how he got home, only that his mother wept when she saw the marks, but never spoke of them to anyone. Matthias wrote quickly, though his hand trembled. Jonas's testimony transformed Elise's crimes from whispers into undeniable fact. Here was living proof, scarred flesh and haunted memory. Jonas described waking night after night for years afterward, unable to swallow, choking on air that seemed to turn to cloth in his throat. He ate slowly his entire life, always with pain, his voice reduced to the rasp Matthias now heard. He said that no priest had ever asked him what happened. No physician had dared question Elise's role. The scars were left unrecorded, hidden beneath his scarf, a private evidence of cruelty no one had wanted to acknowledge. As Jonas spoke, Matthias felt the full weight of what Elise's experiments of stillness meant. The cradles were not symbols. They were instruments. The ledgers were not imagination. They were records of children measured as Jonas had been measured, their cries timed, their silence celebrated. He thought of the initials carved into wood, each one a life perhaps ended, perhaps marked like Jonas but forced into a silence too deep to speak of. The scale of her crime stretched before him like a field without end. Jonas's eyes glistened as he spoke of the humming. He said it had never left his ears, that even now in his old age he heard it when the night grew still. He believed Elise had chosen hymns on purpose to cloak her cruelty in the guise of holiness. To Jonas, the sound of faith had become the sound of pain. He warned Matthias that if he went further, if he opened more of her records or sought more of Her past, he would carry that humming too. Silence, he said, was not absence. It was a presence Elise had planted in those she touched. The archivist closed his ledger and thanked Jonas, though the words felt small against the weight of what he had heard. Outside, the evening light stretched thin across the fields. The village seemed quieter now, its silence no longer natural but heavy, as though the ground itself remembered. Matthias walked back slowly, the sound of his boots hollow against the earth. Each scar on Jonas's throat was a testimony louder than any cry, proof that Elise had not acted in secrecy alone but in plain sight, under the cover of service, with no hand raised to stop her. Matthias knew what must come next. The scars proved survival, but they also implied countless others had not been spared. He thought of the loft floor, the dust arranged in squares, the smell of smoke in the cloth. He realized there were likely bodies hidden still, transformed into dust and straw, the final evidence Elise had left behind. Jonas had given him a key, not only to memory but to the physical truth waiting to be unearthed. If Elise had sought to measure silence, she had measured it in bones as well as in scars. He turned his steps toward the barn once more, knowing that beneath its swept floors and arranged cradles lay the remnants of children whose cries had been silenced forever. The boy who could not swallow had spoken, and his words demanded that the ground itself be forced to speak next. The barn, once only a locked mystery, now stood as an open wound Matthias could not ignore. After hearing Jonas Keller's story, he returned with the conviction that more than scars lingered within those walls. The loft was too orderly, the cradles too precise, the silence too heavy to belong only to memory. He suspected something lay hidden beneath the floor, something Elise had taken great care to preserve. With help from a reluctant farmer who agreed to lend tools but would not cross the threshold, Matthias began his search. The planks groaned under his weight as he pried them up one by one. Dust rose in steady clouds, coating his face and hands, but beneath the boards he found not soil but hollows. They had been dug with deliberate effort, narrow pits stretching the length of the loft, each one positioned beneath a row of cradles. The cavities were filled with straw, darkened by age, but the texture was wrong. When he scooped a handful, it sifted too finely through his fingers. What appeared to be straw mixed with earth was something else entirely. He lit the lantern closer, heart pounding, and saw the pale fragments glimmering among the husks. Tiny shards of bone, brittle and powdery, crumbled under his touch. The straw had been packed with what remained of bodies, burned and crushed until they no longer resembled flesh. He felt the weight of ash cling to his skin, refusing to let go. It was not burial nor even concealment. It was transformation. Elise had returned her victims to dust and then stored them in the very bedding of the cradles that once held their living forms. The horror of it was not only the death, but the method. She had reduced life to measurement. Villagers later whispered that Elise had often been seen carrying small clay bowls, scales tucked into her basket. She weighed the contents carefully, recording the numbers in ledgers no one else saw. Mothers thought she measured fabric for gowns. Fathers assumed she tallied scraps for sewing. In truth, she had been recording the weight of silence, the ash of stilled voices. For Elise, every child's remains were not an end, but a unit of record. Matthias lowered himself into the first cavity, hands trembling as he sifted deeper. The dust rose thick, choking him, carrying the acrid scent of burned linen. Scattered within were fragments too distinct to be mistaken, a jaw no bigger than his thumb, the curve of a rib, the pebble-like remains of knuckles. They had been crushed beneath stones, ground until they lost form, then mingled with straw to disguise their presence. He imagined her bent over the fire, patient as always, pressing weight against fragile bones until they surrendered. He imagined her humming as she measured the dust, believing she was perfecting her silence. The loft became unbearable with the knowledge. Every cradle, once empty to his eye, was now full. The blackened cloths were not bedding but coverings for what lay beneath. Each row was both display and grave, lined not with sleeping children but with their dust. The symmetry of the loft revealed itself in a new light. It was her system, each cradle paired with its hollow, each hollow filled with the crushed remains of silence. Matthias staggered back, the lantern shaking in his grasp. He felt trapped within a ritual not his own, as if by uncovering the dust he had joined Elise's design. He set the lantern on the desk where her ledgers lay and opened one again, scanning the columns. Alongside her notes of sound and stillness, he found small numbers measured in ounces and grams. At the time, he had not understood their meaning. Now the truth was clear. She had weighed the silence itself, marking how much ash a child produced when stilled. In her twisted reasoning, silence was not real unless it could be quantified, carried in a bowl, measured on a scale. The villagers who had avoided the barn now gathered near its edges as Matthias worked, though none dared enter. They murmured stories of Elise's odd habits. They remembered how she brushed dust from her apron, how she scraped ashes into jars after burning scraps of cloth. They had thought it eccentricity, the harmless quirks of a lonely seamstress. Now those gestures revealed their darker meaning. Every fleck of ash she carried had once been breath, once been cry, once been life. When Matthias emerged from the loft, his face pale with dust and grief, the villagers turned away. Some wept quietly. Others stared at the ground, ashamed of their silence. For decades they had passed the barn without looking, had allowed Elise her place on the edge of the village. Now the truth of what she had done clung to them all. They had allowed her obsession to root itself in their soil, and it had grown unchecked until children were returned to them silent or never returned at all. The archivist recorded every detail, but words felt small against the enormity of the discovery. The cradles that seemed empty were not empty at all. They held the memory of cries extinguished, the dust of bodies undone by fire and stone. Each hollow beneath the floor was a measure of Elise's devotion to silence, proof that she had turned death into craft. Her philosophy was complete. Sound destroyed, silence created, ash preserved. As Matthias closed his book, he felt the barn's silence pressing in once more. But now he understood it was not absence. It was the weight of countless voices ground into dust, layered beneath his feet, woven into straw. Elise's work had not vanished with her. It lingered, patient and suffocating, waiting for anyone who dared to listen. He left the loft with the certainty that her crimes were not finished. For dust did not vanish. It settled, it endured, it whispered from every corner of the barn. And in the ledgers yet unopened, he knew he would find the rest of her philosophy, written not in ash, but in numbers. The last step of her belief that silence could outlive even death. The last ledger lay heavier than the others, its spine cracked from use, its pages thick with ink pressed too hard into the fibers. Matthias opened it with the weight of dust still on his hands, the memory of bone fragments clinging to his skin. This was no ordinary record. It was not merely a list of initials or weights of ash or notes about stitches. It was a complete manifesto of Elise's obsession, a document that revealed not just her actions but her philosophy. The entries began with a cruel precision. At the top of each page was an initial, followed by numbers that stretched into hours, days, even weeks. Beside them were notes written in the same compact script as her sewing patterns. But these were not notes of fabric or measurements of cloth. They were charts of duration of stillness. She recorded how long each child cried before yielding, How many minutes of silence followed? How long that silence could be sustained once she applied her methods? The writing was calm, unhurried, as if she were recording rainfall or crop yields. Matthias read one entry aloud under his breath. A case, stillness sustained for 12 hours, milk resin effective, throat-coated, minimal resistance after second feeding. Another, MR, reads inserted, collapse achieved within 6 cries, silence complete, eyes wide, no sound. He turned the pages, each one more chilling than the last. Elise was not guessing, not improvising. She was conducting experiments, adjusting variables, and charting results as if silence itself were a science to be perfected. She wrote of boiling milk laced with resin until it thickened, then feeding it to children in small spoons. The resin coated their throats, sealing their voices in layers until they could no longer cry, only gape in airless gasps. She wrote of how the mothers praised her afterward, remarking that their children were quiet, obedient, so peaceful. Elise recorded these comments with satisfaction, as if they were proof of her success. Other entries described reeds cut from riverbanks, slender tubes sharpened at one end. She wrote of sliding them into infants' throats, collapsing the delicate voice box so that no sound could pass. She noted which reeds worked best, which broke too easily, which left bruises too visible for mothers to ignore. To her, these were technical adjustments, the refinements of a craftswoman determined to master her material. The most grotesque entries detailed plaster masks. Elise mixed chalk, water, and glue to form a paste which she spread over children's faces, encasing their heads until the mixture hardened. The masks froze their expressions mid-scream or mid-breath, preserving what she called the peace of stillness. She recorded the time it took for the paste to dry, the way the skin beneath reacted, the silence that followed. She even noted the weight of each mask, writing with satisfaction that the added pressure encouraged stillness to deepen. As Matthias read, the air in the loft seemed to thicken around him. He could picture her working by lamplight, her hands steady, her face composed. She was no wild killer, but a patient seamstress of silence, convinced she was shaping purity itself. In her mind, sound was corruption, noise was disorder, and silence was the ultimate perfection. She sought to build not just one quiet child, but a whole choir of them. A community of mute voices aligned in rows like the cradles in her loft. The ledger's margins were filled with musings that revealed the depth of her obsession. She wrote of how noise frayed the spirit, how cries tore at the peace of mothers, how God's true gift was the hush of the grave carried into life. She imagined a village where no child cried at night, where no mother woke in exhaustion, where every household was free of disorder. It was a vision of control disguised as mercy, a nightmare cloaked in service. Matthias copied passages, his hand nearly failing him. The horror was not only in what Elise had done, but in how ordinary her language made it seem. She wrote of resin, reeds, plaster, and cord with the same tone another seamstress might use to describe thread and fabric. Her cruelty was made more terrifying by its calmness. It was never rage, never frenzy. It was patience, precision, and belief. He thought of Jonas Keller, of the scars across his throat, and realized how many others had endured variations of these experiments. Some survived with voices broken, others with silence permanent, and many did not survive at all. The loft was no longer just a room of cradles and ash. It was a laboratory, a cathedral of stillness where Elise recorded her doctrine with ink and blood alike. In the later pages, the obsession turned prophetic. Elise wrote of creating a choir of silence, a generation of children who would never raise their voices, who would serve as proof of her craft. She believed that silence was contagious, that once enough children were perfected, the village itself would learn to hush, to bend toward her vision. She wrote that sound was rebellion, but silence was obedience, and obedience was purity. Matthias closed the book for a moment, unable to bear more. The barn pressed in on him with the weight of what it had held. Dust and bones below, cradles above, and here in his hands the scripture of silence itself. It was not only evidence of crime, it was the philosophy of a woman who believed she had mastered life and death. He forced himself to read the final pages. There she wrote of legacy, of the need for someone to continue her work. She admitted she could not complete the choir alone, but she believed the ledgers would be found by one who understood. She wrote, "The silence must outlive me." The thought chilled Matthias more than anything else. It suggested she had always known discovery would come, and she had welcomed it, trusting that her vision would spread. Matthias laid the ledger on the desk, his notes beside it. The truth was undeniable now. Elise had not been a caregiver who faltered, nor a seamstress with odd habits. She had been an architect of silence, a methodical creator of horror. Her obsession was systemic, deliberate, and vast. He left the barn with the book clutched to his chest. The villagers who saw him pass looked away, as if afraid the knowledge might cling to them. But Matthias knew the ledger was no longer just history. It was testimony, and it demanded exposure. Elise's silence could not remain hers alone. It had to be spoken, even if the speaking tore open wounds the village had spent generations burying. The barn's silence no longer belonged only to Matthias. Word spread through the village, slow at first, then faster, like a contagion carried from mouth to mouth despite every attempt to keep it hidden. Mothers whispered of the marks they had once seen on their children's throats. Fathers remembered Elise arriving in the night with her basket of cloth, offering to watch restless infants when exhaustion had hollowed their eyes. The weight of memory, long suppressed, broke open under the proof Matthias carried in his ledger, and the dust he had pulled from beneath the loft. By the spring of 1881, the authorities could no longer ignore it. Parish officials, pressed by Matthias's notes and the murmured testimonies of survivors, ordered an arrest. Elise Baumgartner was taken from her narrow timber house without resistance. She did not fight, did not curse, did not plead. She merely gathered her shawl around her shoulders and followed, her eyes vacant, her lips pressed thin. Some swore they heard her humming as she walked between the officers, a sound so soft it was almost mistaken for breath. The trial was held in the district court, a stone building whose walls had never heard such accusations. The gallery filled with villagers who had once avoided speaking her name. Now they sat pressed together, faces pale, waiting to hear their silences given form. Matthias sat among them, the ledgers laid out before the magistrates, his notes stacked high. The evidence had been catalogued, rows of cradles blackened with soot, hollows beneath the loft packed with bone and ash, cords stiffened with wax, plaster masks crumbled but unmistakable. Each object was displayed as though part of an exhibit, proof of a craft so perverse it seemed impossible it had lived unnoticed for decades. Witness after witness came forward, mothers who remembered leaving their children with Elise only to find them returned unnaturally quiet. Fathers who recalled faint bruises they had chosen not to question. Jonas Keller himself sat before the court, scarf pulled away, revealing the scars that still laced his throat. His voice, broken and raspy, filled the chamber as he described the humming in the loft, the cords biting into his skin, the way Elise's eyes never flickered with doubt. His testimony silenced even the magistrates, leaving only the sound of the quill scratching as clerks recorded his words. Through it all, Elise sat still. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers moving as though threading invisible needles. Her eyes did not wander, her gaze fixed on a point no one else could see. When called upon to respond, she did not speak. Her lips parted only to hum, a faint, tuneless vibration that unsettled every listener. The magistrate demanded answers, pressed her to account for the ledgers, the ashes, the scars. But Elise never raised her voice. Her silence was her only defense, her humming her only confession. The prosecutor read aloud from her journals, forcing the court to hear her words as she had written them. The cry stills here. Resistance fades. Perfection is silence. Each phrase struck the gallery like a hammer. People wept openly, some turned away, unwilling to face the woman who had written them. Yet Elise remained unchanged, her calm face betraying neither pride nor shame. It was as though she considered herself beyond the judgment of the living, already belonging to a world where silence reigned. When the evidence of bones was presented, a hush deeper than grief filled the chamber. Bowls of ash, fragments of ribs no larger than a child's finger, scales Elise had used to weigh her silence, all were laid before the magistrates. Matthias explained their discovery, his voice unsteady but clear. He described the hollows beneath the loft, the way each cradle had been paired with its grave, the dust that clung to his hands. He declared that this was not accident, not madness, but method, a system devised and sustained over years. Still, Elise sat unmoved. She did not glance at the evidence, did not flinch at the testimony. Her fingers continued their phantom weaving as though she stitched the very air into stillness. When asked again if she wished to speak in her defense, she hummed louder, a single drawn-out tone that froze the gallery. Some covered their ears, others shivered as though a cold wind had passed through them. The magistrate struck his gavel, demanding order, but the sound of Elise's hum lingered even after she closed her mouth. The verdict was inevitable. The court declared her guilty on every count that could be spoken, though many crimes would never be measured in law. Sentenced to life imprisonment, she stood only when ordered, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, revealing hands pale and thin. She bowed her head not in submission, but in continuation of her silence. No plea, no word of sorrow, no cry of denial left her lips. She left the courtroom as she had entered it, humming under her breath as though to remind them all that sound belonged to her even when she refused speech. For the villagers, the trial was both revelation and condemnation. They saw in Elise not only a monster, but a mirror of their own silence. They had allowed her to serve, to watch their children, to stitch their shrouds, and had looked away when unease rose. Now, as she disappeared behind prison walls, they were left with the knowledge that her crimes had lived among them because they had chosen not to see. Matthias left the court carrying the final ledger, entrusted to him for safekeeping in the archives. Its pages felt heavier than any sentence, heavier than the stones of the prison that would hold her. For even in judgment, Elise had spoken without words, her silence louder than testimony, her humming a song that refused to fade. He realized then that exposure did not end her influence. It only forced it into new shadows, where silence might yet endure. Elise Baumgartner never spoke a word in prison. From the day the iron doors closed behind her in 1881 until her death 23 years later, she kept her silence as firmly as she had imposed it on others. Guards reported that she hummed softly at night. The same tuneless vibration Matthias and the villagers remembered from the courtroom. She sewed prison linens with the same precision she had once applied to baptism gowns, her fingers moving in tireless rhythm. When asked about her past, she lowered her eyes and stitched faster, as if every question were a tear she must mend. She died in her cell in the winter of 1904, her body found curled as though she were still at her workbench, hands clasped around invisible thread. Her death did not bury her legacy. The ledgers remained, stored first in district archives, then forgotten in boxes until decades later. In the 1920s, when officials reviewed old parish material, Matthias's notes resurfaced alongside the journals, the plaster fragments, and the scales Elise had used. Scholars read them with horror, realizing they were not only records of crime but early documents of systematic child harm. By then, many in the village who had known Elise were gone, but whispers still clung to the barn. Families avoided the road that passed it, and children were told stories about the seamstress who could steal voices. The authorities moved quietly, unwilling to stir scandal but determined to prevent repetition. Laws were revised without Elise's name ever spoken. Midwives were required to hold licenses, their work documented and inspected. Records of births and child deaths were standardized, ensuring no infant could vanish into silence without account. Unmarked burials were forbidden, every grave to carry name and record. These measures were presented as progress, as modernization of care, but beneath the language lay the shadow of Elise's barn. The state could not risk admitting how such horror had thrived in plain sight, yet it feared the silence might return if left unchecked. In the village itself, the barn stood for years in disrepair. After Elise's arrest, it had been sealed, its cradles removed, its loft emptied, though dust still clung to the planks. Some wanted it torn down, but others argued it should remain as warning. It leaned through storms and seasons until finally a memorial was built beside it. A plain stone marker rose near the field's edge, inscribed not with names but with a single line: "For the children who never cried again." Mothers began leaving strips of white cloth there, folded like baptism gowns, fluttering in the wind as silent prayers. The barn itself was eventually dismantled, its timber scattered, but the ground where it stood was left bare. No crop ever planted there again. The ledgers traveled further than the barn's ruins. By the mid-20th century, they had reached historians who studied them not only as evidence of one woman's cruelty, but as a reflection of how communities could harbor such evil without intervention. Scholars wrote of Elise as a hidden psychopath, a figure who blended into ordinary life, disguising her obsession within service and ritual. They noted how she used roles trusted by all, seamstress, caregiver, mourner, to mask her methods. She needed no secrecy because her patience and her smile were disguise enough. The most chilling conclusion was not that Elise had acted, but that she had been allowed to act, her silence mirrored by those around her. For Matthias, who had lived long enough to see her imprisonment but not the later reforms, the ledger was both burden and duty. His final writings spoke of the weight of silence, of how evil did not roar but whispered, how it often worked with patience, not violence. He warned that societies fall, quiet around those who promise order, even when that order is born of cruelty. His words became marginal notes in the archives, yet they lingered, echoing the unease he had felt when he first pressed his hand against the locked barn door. Today, near the field where the barn once stood, the memorial remains. Visitors see the white cloths, replaced generation after generation, a ritual of remembrance. Locals say the air there is unnaturally still, that even the wind hushes when one approaches. Some hear humming when the evening falls, though none admit it for fear of sounding foolish. Yet the memory is undeniable. The ground holds it, the village carries it, and the laws born from it continue to shape the world beyond. The story of Elise Baumgartner is not told loudly. It survives in the margins of records, in the quiet rituals of remembrance, in the reforms that no one admits their true origin. But the truth lingers for those willing to look. Evil does not always scream, it hums. It smiles faintly. It hides inside the ordinary tasks of care, the gestures of service, the faces we trust without question. It does not rush. It waits. It works patiently, convinced of its purpose, confident that others will prefer silence to confrontation. And so the question remains, left for those who hear this story now. What do you think? Could this happen again? Could silence still be mistaken for peace and care for cruelty? Could another Elise live in plain sight, sewing garments, holding children, measuring their cries in secret? The memorial cloths whisper that it could, unless silence itself is challenged. The humming has not vanished. It waits just beyond the edge of hearing for those willing to listen.